Next up is Bekka Schaffer. Bekka is the Manager of Development and Stewardship at Braven, Inc., a national nonprofit focused on empowering college students for impactful careers. Someone told me don't use a staple. They were correct. Prior to her role at Braven, Bekka served as a college and career guidance counselor dedicated to providing equitable education opportunities to young people in Chicago. A graduate from the University of Chicago in 2018, Bekka is currently pursuing an MBA at U of C Booth School of Business. She is an active leader in her community at Oasis Church Chicago. She's also a reader, a writer, a pop culture enthusiast, and she's thinking about getting into jogging. She says probably not, and I can tell you don't have time. You don't have time. Come on up.
Hello. Hi, thanks. Okay. So when I first applied to the University of Chicago, I didn't know anything. And that's not just me being self-deprecating. My roommate, who is here, tells me I'm not allowed to say I don't know. I went through a phase where I was always like, oh, I don't know. And she said I have to admit that I do know things sometimes, but I really didn't know anything back then. I didn't know anything about school. I didn't know anything about college. I didn't know anything about how to apply to college. My mother dropped out of college when she was in her first semester, and my dad dropped out of high school. So those conversations were just not things that we were having in our house. I didn't know that U Chicago was considered a pseudo Ivy League. I definitely didn't know that their slogan was "Where fun comes to die," and yeah, I didn't know it was like really, really freaking hard. But what I did know about was my family. I grew up in Kansas City. I loved living with my family. I am the daughter of Denise and Nisha Schaffer. I am the younger sister of Stephanie and the big sister of William and Elizabeth. And I just wasn't the type of person who ever had dreams of leaving home. But my high school guidance counselor, Miss Tony, told me I needed to apply anyway, so I did. And the night before the application was due, I remember sitting on my bed in the room that I shared with my 5-year-old sister, and I started writing the essay. Maybe you all know this, obviously I did not, but U Chicago is really well known for having these quirky, weird application questions like apples or oranges, and that's the question, or where's Waldo? And I don't know. So I chose the question that I thought I could make the most amount of sense of, which was a Spanish quote that I thought about sharing with you all tonight, but I keep forgetting to become bilingual, and my Duolingo streak is 2 days. So loosely translated, the quote was essentially a prompt asking us to consider, are we made up mostly of our circumstances, or are we people that are made up mostly of our biology? So essentially, what is the stuff that we're made up of? And so, of course, with 1 hour left before I had to submit the essay, I wrote about the thing that I know, which is family. I wrote about how I inherited my humility from my father, how I inherited my grace from my mother, my sister's bravery, my brother's sense of individuality, and my youngest sister's creativity. Essentially, that I wasn't me without them. Which is a really sweet thing to say, but horrible in practice when you then get accepted to the University of Chicago and you have to move away from these people. So it was a huge surprise that I was accepted, was not considering that as a possibility. And I just remember when the letter came in, my dad running around the house screaming, $280,000. Which is the amount of money that he was not about to spend on my tuition. And so he and my mom were calling our relatives, and they were crying and celebrating, and I was crying too, but for different reasons. I just was so sad that I was going to have to leave them. I still recall the day that we actually moved in and they dropped me off, and it sounds so dramatic, but it felt that way. I was looking out the window and I could see my little sister crying and waving from our family's van, and I was crying and just had never felt more heartbroken in my whole life. So the adjustment to life at UChicago, as you can imagine, was really, really, really tough. Beyond the rigorous academics, I just had never actually faced loneliness or depression or anxiety ever in my life. So it really was the first time that I felt like I didn't even recognize myself. And one afternoon, I was maybe about 3 weeks in, I was sitting in our lounge in our dorm, and I was working on my calculus homework, which was kicking my ass. And I was just surrounded by everything else around me was so normal. There were people at the table that were working on their homework too. There were some guys playing video games across the hall. There were some girls cooking and laughing in the kitchen. And I felt like I was getting swallowed up and just drowning in anxiety. So I got up, I calmly closed my book, and I just went outside into our courtyard, and I just remember looking up at the sky. It was October, so it was very gray, and I pulled out my phone and very calmly called my mom, and with tears streaming down my face, I told her that I had to come home. And I just remember apologizing like over and over and over again because I knew what a huge opportunity I was giving up to get this world-class education and to get it for free and to be the first in my family to go to college, and I just couldn't hack it. And so I felt really torn, but I also knew what felt very true at the time was just like, I can't survive here without them. And if you ask my mom today, this is still like the worst call she's ever gotten. But so we agreed that I would wait until Christmas and then we would reassess. And honestly, there was something about knowing that my time on campus was going to be limited that made me feel really free. Like anything bad could happen and I would just be like, whatever, I'm leaving, doesn't matter. And so in order to fill the rest of my time there, I started volunteering at an after-school program called By the Hand in Chicago's South Side in Inglewood. And from the moment that I arrived at the school, I felt this immediate sense of belonging that I hadn't felt when I showed up on campus. And I was placed in a classroom of fourth graders, and the first student that I met, her name is Tamia, and we just had the best time. And I remember before I left, she said, "Ms. Bekka, lots of people come here, but usually they don't come back. So will you be back?" And I said yes, and I kept my promise week after week after week. And eventually, By the Hand and the students there, they felt less like a chore or less like something to do to check off or even like a community service project. They really became my family. And it became more about being there for Tamia and keeping my promise, being able to play basketball with Isaac, being able to help Kayla excel in reading. And I loved it. And it didn't feel like an obligation anymore. And so By the Hand is where I learned that family doesn't just have to be the family that I inherit. It gets to be one that I can build. So when Christmas came around, my parents asked me if I was ready to come home, and I surprised them and myself by saying no, that I would come back. So I did. And next month, on September 21st, I will be celebrating 10 years in Chicago. Thank you. Don't ask me how many parking tickets I've gotten in that time. But yeah, thank you. But in those 10 years, I have dedicated my studies and my career to the pursuit of education equity for students like my students at By the Hand and students like myself. And all the while, I've been building a new family. And so I suppose now, 10 years later, if you were to ask me to rewrite my application that I did for UChicago, I would still talk about family, but I think it wouldn't be as limited, and it would be mostly about the things that I've learned from the small families that I've built along the way. So I would say that I got my joy from my students at By the Hand and the students that I worked with at Chicago Hope Academy. I learned my curiosity from my peers at UChicago. I learned my generosity from my friends at Oasis Church Chicago, and my deep sense of equity from my team and the students that we work with at Braven. And I learned my love of storytelling from all of you, from being in communities like this who show up, who sit, who listen, and who honor the importance of sharing our stories. Thank you.